The Compliance Perspectives podcast is sponsored by Case IQ, a global provider of whistleblowing case management and compliance solutions. Learn more at caseiq.com. Welcome to the Compliance Perspectives podcast. I'm Adam Turteltaub from the Society of Corporate Compliance and Ethics and Healthcare Compliance Association. Joining us from Chicago today is Ahmed Salim. Ahmed is a director at a professional consulting firm, healthcare compliance and regulatory adjunct professor at DePaul University, and most importantly for this podcast, author of our newest SCCE and HCCA book, Mastering Compliance Through Change Management. Ahmed, thanks so much for contributing and writing the book with us and for taking some time to talk about some of the key points in it. First, let me ask a question. We hear the phrase change management often, and it seems to be self-explanatory, but my first question is it that simple?
I think the concept of change management is easy. I think the execution is where people get into trouble, myself included. And I think the idea of implementing a new policy or training in nature seems simplistic, but it's the concepts of the change management. When you understand and kind of see things through, it makes much more sense when you're a bit more in tune with it. And what I mean by that is, having the appropriate planning, which we'll talk about later in the steps, but planning and thinking through how you want to essentially implement the type of change, regardless if it's a policy or an audit within your organization.
That's good to hear. And it does start getting into some of the more subtleties that I thought that there had to be there beyond just the simplicity of the term. Now, you advocate for putting in place a compliance change management model. What would that consist of?
So based on, other leaders of the change management world, I refer to Cotter and Lewin and Adkar in the book, kind of put together the principles of make sense when you're building an effective compliance program and how to build and strengthen your program. So, the information we have 8 stages. So first stage is vision and strategy. Second stage is building leadership and sponsorship. Third stage is communication and awareness. The fourth stage is training and capability building. The fifth stage is implementation and reinforcement. The sixth stage is continuous monitoring and improvement. The seventh stage is sustaining the change. And finally, the eighth stage is feedback and adaptation. And essentially, it was taking information from thought leaders in change management, but also incorporating how we build an effective compliance program, make change management kind of tie back to compliance in the compliance world.
That's an interesting approach, all those stages there. So given all of them and how they need to work together and how you need to make sure that you have a compliance-focused outcome, what have you found are the keys to the success?
Well, so I'll kind of answer that question, kind of going in order in a little bit more depth into the stages. First and foremost, having a vision and a strategy of what you're trying to implement, right? So let's take an example of a new policy that's going to change the way things are done in your organization. Typically, if someone is trying to roll out a policy, you want to have some sort of strategy and thoughtful way of rolling out your policy, creating your policy, working with stakeholders, right? There's a whole environment of people in your organization that you must work with to get your policy to be successful, especially when you implement. So first thing thinking through the strategy. The second thing is building a leadership and sponsorship, right? You can't work in a silo. You need to lean on leadership buy-in, senior management buy-in. You need the stakeholders to back you for, whatever policy you're going to roll out. Third, communication awareness. If people don't know about it, it's not going to be successful. Fourth, training, right? While you are alerting people of it, you got to make sure that you're training. Fifth, the implementation aspect, right? So basically moving into effectively rolling out what the policy is and doing it in a way where you're not just sending an email once and saying, hey, we have a new policy, but enforcing the message of the new policy and leaning on the stages previously, right, to kind of push that message through. So think through like how you rely on the stakeholders you've brought into the process. Sixth, continue to monitor, right? Like, are people accessing this new policy, right? Depending on your tech, you should be able to see if people are looking at the policy, how many people are utilizing it. You can look at certain KPIs, how people are reacting to the policy. So it's important to kind of make sure that you're continuing to monitor and then look for improvement. And then sustaining the change is the seventh one. So like making sure the policy just doesn't fall flat, right? If there's anything else related to then the policy changes, organization, like making sure you're working towards that. And again, every single step still goes back to the first stage, which is the planning. And then finally, feedback and adaptation, right? So adaptation, excuse me. I think people often think, and myself included, once a project is completed, it's out of mind. And that's not true. If for it to be successful, you've got to get your feedback. You're getting feedback throughout the process, right? If you're having a policy, you're going to ask for feedback from stakeholders to make sure it makes sense. But afterwards, right, now that it's out in the organization, like you want to make sure you're understanding where the pain points are, where you're being successful. If you need to make any changes, like that gives you the ability to kind of get the frame of mind to do so.
I have to say, as you were describing all that, first of all, I have to admit I feel very guilty. I'm certainly many times finished a project, felt like I was done with it and didn't realize, no, I need to watch what actually happens. But secondly, as you're talking about all the various elements for success, so many of them overlap with elements of an effective compliance program and what compliance people do. It really shows that if you take this compliance change management approach, you're not being asked to reinvent the wheel completely, but in fact leverage the skills you've already developed, which is just terrific. Can you give us a quick overview of a case where this change management model was successfully implemented?
Yeah, and I think we're all guilty of kind of rushing through once a project is done, right? Projects take a long time. As soon as you're done, you kind of just want to get off your plate. So it kind of goes hand in hand with my example. A handful of years ago, I had to implement a compliance committee at a new organization that didn't have a compliance program. And so coming from organizations that had like really robust programs, my understanding was you're going to roll out a compliance program, you're going to roll out a compliance committee, it's going to be pretty straightforward. Get your stakeholders, schedule your meeting, and let's get the deck together and pitch it to them. And so that's exactly what happened, right? I decided who should be the attendees, right? Worked with myself in like a silo to do that. Sent the invites out and then put together the content again in a silo, thinking what would make sense. And then the time came and half the committee didn't show up because it was a brand new committee and people had no idea what it was about, didn't think it was important. And then the second half of the committee felt like they weren't part of the process, right? They were told to show up to this meeting. The organization didn't really have a compliance program, so they had no idea what this committee would entail, and they didn't really agree with what was being brought up on the agenda in the packet. And so that was my realization that I had dropped the ball on effectively planning and trying to change a culture without like taking the steps necessary. And so it was a good learning process, right? So we had a lot of dialogue and discussion with the stakeholders to figure out like what we needed to do to make it more successful. And when I was going through that, and I think about it now, it aligns to exactly what we're talking about in the book and talks about in just general compliance and effective compliance program, which is having the vision, right? Having the training, like going through a process, making sure that you're planning and not just stopping there, right? Making sure that you're implementing it and checking your implementation, and continuing to monitor for the success. And so we did do that, right? It took time, and about 2 to 3 quarters later, full participation. Everyone, there's dialogue, right? People, the right questions. They're taking content back to their departments, right? Dashboards are completed, able to kind of produce a solid output. And it was a eye-opener for me, and that's kind of what led me to start really learning more about change management and kind of seeing the parallels between the change management world and how we can be more effective in the compliance world.
That's a great story, and it makes a very good point. Also, that just because you might have had a bad start doesn't mean you're going to have a bad finish, and that by learning from what went wrong at the outset, you can end up in a much better place at the end. So, how else can compliance teams make change management an integrated part of their compliance programs?
I think the probably first step for any program is to make sure your department understands, right? The first question is what is change management? And then thinking through if it's your work plan, right? If it's audits, if it's anything that you have new up and coming, how do you implement change management into your day-to-day operations? And it's a fancy term. I know we're always throwing around this concept of change management, but it is something that has to be a part of your day-to-day. You've always got to be thinking through how you can effectively implement compliance strategies that you want to do in a future state or you're doing in a current state by utilizing the principles of change management. And so, going through the 8 stages of the compliance change model, every single one of those aspects was in a different part of the journey to implement something new, something that's already been in place. So it's changing the narrative and the tone and the understanding and making it kind of a everyday part of your compliance program. And it's everyone's job to be aware of the compliance change management process within the department.
Well, Ahmed, thank you so much for giving this overview of change management and how it applies to compliance teams in this podcast. And thank you for giving us the greater in-depth look at it in the new book, Mastering Compliance Through Change Management. I want to thank all of you for taking the time to listen. I'm Adam Turteltaub from SCCE and HCCA. Hope we're able to expand your compliance perspective.